The city that never slept, New York, was awash in the golden glow of an autumn sunset. The skyline gleamed in the fading light, casting long shadows over the streets, where yellow cabs scurried like busy bees. Atop one of the tallest buildings in the Upper East Side, Clara Johnson's penthouse stood as a silent witness to the elegance and quiet chaos of her life. To those who had never stepped inside, it was a place of wealth and privilege. But to those who had been close to her, it was far more than that. It was a sanctuary, a place of comfort and warmth and oasis from the relentless pace of the world outside. Clara had always been a woman of grace. Tall with a smile that could disarm the most jaded of strangers, she was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel special. As a renowned interior designer, her vision was unmatched, and the spaces she curated were like canvases filled with the colors of her soul. Yet despite her success, Clara's heart belonged to her family. Her husband, Ethan Hayes, a powerful businessman, was the anchor to her whirlwind life. Together, they had created a world, a home where love was the unspoken bond that held them together. But it wasn't just Ethan who had captured her heart. There was also their 6-year-old daughter, Emma. The joy of Clara's life, Emma had her mother's eyes and her father's curiosity. It was a perfect little family, a perfect little world, or so it seemed. That evening, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Clara had planned to meet her husband for dinner. They were going to discuss a new project she had been hired for, and perhaps, just perhaps, revel in the quiet of a peaceful evening together. But fate had other plans. Clara had made a call to Ethan, laughing lightly, as she told him she would be late, that the traffic was unbearable, and that the rain had made everything worse. Yet it was the last conversation they would ever have. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to end this way. Clara's car skidded on the slick, rain-soaked roads, the tires spinning helplessly as the vehicle veered out of control. The sound of crunching metal echoed into the night. A single flash of light from a passing car illuminated the scene, a moment brief and brutal, forever marking the end of Clara's life. At 8:42 p.m., she was gone. The news came quietly at first, a whisper that grew louder as the hours passed. Ethan Hayes, surrounded by the sterile walls of his office, didn't hear his phone ring. He didn't hear the hushed voices of his colleagues, nor the frantic attempts to reach him. It wasn't until his assistant entered pale and trembling that he was told. Clara was dead. It didn't make sense. The world seemed to stop, the weight of the words hanging in the air, like an ominous cloud choking out every breath he tried to take. His heart stopped, his mind refused to believe, and yet he knew. He knew it was true. His Clara, his love was gone. The call that followed, futile, desperate, full of a heartbreak he could not yet comprehend, was a blur. He stumbled out of the office, the city outside spinning like a carousel he could no longer ride. Nothing made sense. Nothing would ever be the same. And so Ethan Hayes stood at the doorway of his home, his breath shallow, his face pale with the unmistakable pallor of grief. His hand, trembling ever so slightly, rested on the doorframe. The soft murmur of his daughter's voice could be heard from inside the apartment, a fragile sound filled with innocence and confusion. "Mommy, Mommy, where are you?" Ethan's heart shattered as the small figure of Emma appeared from the hallway, her bright eyes wide with uncertainty. She had always been the joy of their home, a reflection of Clara's bright spirit. Yet now the warmth of their life had gone cold. Clara was gone, and in her place was an aching emptiness that threatened to swallow them whole. Emma stopped short as she saw her father. She knew something was wrong, her little face reflecting the disarray of a world suddenly tilted on its axis. "Daddy," she asked, her voice small and fragile. Ethan could barely speak. The words caught in his throat, and he reached down, lifting his daughter into his arms, as though holding her would somehow anchor him to the reality that was slipping away from him. "We have to be brave, sweetheart," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure, Emma or himself. Across the city, Taylor Lawson sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the phone in her hand. It had been a long day of meetings, an ordinary day, until the call came. The call that changed everything. It was her sister's funeral. The accident had taken Clara from her. And now Taylor, always the more grounded one, always the one who provided support, was about to step into a role she had never imagined. "Come back home, Taylor," her mother had urged, her voice shaking. "Ethan needs you. Emma needs you. You're the only one who can help them through this." The world felt impossibly small as Taylor gathered her things. She never thought she would be in this position. Her sister was gone. She wasn't prepared for the life that awaited her stepping into the home of a grieving family, holding together the fragments of a shattered world. But what choice did she have? Family wasn't something you walked away from. Taylor arrived at the Hayes penthouse, her heart heavy with the unspoken burden of what she had to do. The apartment was eerily quiet, the soft ticking of a clock, the only sound that filled the space. Ethan was nowhere to be seen, and Emma, poor Emma, was alone in the living room, looking for her mother, unable to understand why her world had suddenly shifted into a shadow of loss. Ethan finally emerged from the shadows, his eyes hollow, the weight of a grief too vast for words clouding his every movement. His gaze met Taylor's, and for a moment time seemed to pause. They had always been close siblings who could finish each other's sentences, share laughter over old jokes. But now, in the wake of Clara's death, their bond would be tested in ways they never imagined. Taylor stepped forward, her voice a soft whisper, but strong enough to cut through the grief hanging in the air. "I'm here, Ethan. I'm here for Emma. I'll help you through this. We'll get through it together." Ethan nodded, but it was clear that his world was shattered. Taylor reached out to him, placing a hand on his arm, and for the first time, Ethan let himself lean into her support. He was no longer alone. The road ahead would be long. There would be tears, there would be arguments, and perhaps there would be moments of healing. But one thing was certain: the family that had been would never be the same. Yet perhaps in this new reality, there was a chance for love to grow, for healing to take root in a home filled with sorrow. And as Taylor looked out across the room, her heart ached for what had been lost, but there was also a flicker of hope. Perhaps in the future, love could find a way back to this fractured home. But for now, it was enough to know that for Emma, at least, there was one person who would never leave her side. If you've ever been touched by the power of family and love, let us know how you've overcome moments of loss. Leave a comment, share your story, and don't forget to like and follow for more emotional journeys that capture the heart. Let's walk this road together. The days that followed Clara's death blurred into a haze of half-remembered conversations and unspoken grief. In the sprawling penthouse, the space once filled with laughter and light now felt hollow, as though the walls themselves mourned the loss of the woman who had brought so much warmth into their home. The luxury of the apartment, polished marble floors, glistening chandeliers, rich mahogany furniture, seemed almost foreign now, as if it no longer held the same meaning without Clara's presence to fill it with life. Ethan Hayes wandered through the rooms like a ghost, his movements slow, deliberate, as though each step took more effort than the last. His once sharp features now wore a permanent mask of fatigue, his eyes clouded with sorrow. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and brokered multi-million-dollar deals with a cool and calculating precision now found himself utterly adrift. His world, once built on firm foundations of ambition and success, had collapsed in an instant. And then there was Emma, the child whose bright eyes and boundless energy had once lit up every corner of the penthouse, now left to navigate a world without her mother. She was silent much of the time, a quiet sadness settling over her small shoulders. Her once girlish laughter, so full of life, was now replaced by long silences, her deep brown eyes following Ethan and Taylor with a quiet, unspoken plea for understanding. She had stopped asking about her mother, but her face, the way it lit up when Taylor entered the room, the way she clung to her aunt like a lifeline, spoke louder than any words could. Taylor Lawson, standing at the doorway of the nursery that once belonged to her sister, felt a sharp pang in her chest as she gazed at Emma's abandoned toys, the pastel pink walls now somehow so still, so quiet. The room, once a reflection of Clara's joy at becoming a mother, now stood as a stark reminder of the life that had been taken too soon. It had only been 2 weeks since Clara's funeral, But in those days, Taylor had slipped into a rhythm she never thought she would adopt. She had become a mother, a protector, a rock, though her heart ached with every step. The weight of Clara's absence pressed on her, constantly pulling her down in a way she couldn't quite escape. She had promised to stay strong for Emma, for Ethan, but there were nights when the tears came unbidden and she found herself sitting alone in the dark, wondering how she was supposed to move forward in a world that no longer made sense. Ethan, for all his sorrow, had withdrawn into his grief like a fortress. He hadn't cried, not yet. Perhaps he never would. He had always been a man of control, of calculated decisions, but the death of his wife had stripped away that veneer, leaving him raw and vulnerable in ways he couldn't understand. He had stopped attending meetings, stopped responding to emails, and his business, once a well-oiled machine, now sat neglected on the brink of disaster. The weight of Clara's death wasn't just emotional, it was financial. Ethan had let everything slip, and Taylor knew that if something didn't change soon, everything Clara had built would crumble. And so it was Taylor who picked up the pieces. It wasn't something she had planned to do, but it was something she had to do. Emma needed stability. Ethan needed help. Taylor was the one who could provide it. Every morning she took Emma by the hand and led her to the kitchen, where the smell of pancakes would fill the air, the familiar routine offering a semblance of normalcy. It was a small thing, but it was something. It was what Clara would have wanted. "Mommy used to make pancakes every Saturday, didn't she?" Emma's small voice would whisper, her eyes filled with sadness, but also hope as she watched the batter sizzle in the pan. Taylor would smile softly, brushing a stray curl from Emma's forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, she did. But you know what, I think Mommy would be so proud of you. You're going to make pancakes just like her. One day you'll see." Emma's face brightened ever so slightly, though the sadness never quite left her eyes. "Can we make them for Daddy too?" she asked, her little voice hesitant but full of earnestness. Of course, Taylor replied, her heart swelling with the quiet love she had for her niece. "We'll make the best pancakes for Daddy." While Emma prepared the breakfast, with the careful concentration of a child doing something important, Taylor would slip away for a moment, trying to focus her thoughts. She would find herself staring out the window at the sprawling city below, the endless movement of New York, seeming so distant, so alien in the wake of her sister's death. The phone calls had come, so many calls about the business, about arrangements that needed to be made, about the funeral costs, the family estate. But Ethan had barely spoken on the phone, and when he did, it was only to give curt, emotionless responses. Taylor didn't blame him for it. How could she? The weight of his loss was unbearable, yet she knew that time was slipping away. Emma's future was slipping away. There had to be something more she could do. The decision came one night as Taylor sat across from Ethan at the dinner table, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her wineglass. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the soft clink of silverware and the distant hum of the city outside. "I can't do this alone, Taylor." Ethan finally said, his voice raw, a tremor of vulnerability threading through his words. Taylor looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time that evening. She saw the man she had known, the one who had been so strong, so determined, now worn thin by grief. "I know," she whispered. "And you don't have to. I'm here. I won't let you do it alone. Not while I'm breathing." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world outside seemed to pause, the weight of that promise settling between them. And in that moment, Taylor knew that her life had irrevocably changed. This wasn't just about stepping into Clara's shoes, about filling a void left behind. This was about the future, Emma's future, Ethan's future, and her own. They were all lost in the fog of grief, but together they would find their way out. And perhaps, just perhaps, they would learn to live again. That night, Taylor lay awake in her sister's room, the faint scent of Clara's perfume still lingering in the air. And for the first time since the accident, she allowed herself to think about what came next. The future was unknown, yes, but it was also full of possibility, for her, for Ethan, and for Emma. And somehow, deep within her heart, Taylor knew that this broken family, fractured by loss and grief, would find its way back to each other. They would rebuild. together. But it would take time and love and a courage none of them had yet discovered in the rubble of their grief. The days ahead would be long, but they would face them side by side, no longer alone. The days bled into weeks, each one passing with the quiet inevitability of a tide inching closer to shore. In the large, airy penthouse that had once belonged to Clara Taylor, found herself inhabiting a life she had never asked for. The sprawling rooms adorned with artwork that seemed to tell stories of a world she had never quite understood, now felt as though they were closing in on her. She walked the halls as if they belonged to someone else, her footsteps echoing in the silence, and her reflection in the mirrors seemed foreign, distorted somehow. Each morning she woke early, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her, even before she opened her eyes. The life she had so carefully built, a life filled with purpose, adventure, and her own independence, was now nothing more than a distant memory. She had come to New York with ambition, with dreams of her own. She had always been the one to stand back to watch others shine, content in the knowledge that she would carve her own path in time. But now, as she brushed her fingers through her hair in the reflection of Clara's bedroom mirror, she saw only the remnants of someone she no longer recognized. It wasn't just that she was taking care of Emma, guiding her through the delicate process of grieving, or that she had become the backbone of a family still reeling from the void Clara's death had left. It was that she was beginning to lose herself in the process, losing the person she had been before. The clothes she wore, Clara's oversized sweaters, the scarves that once belonged to her sister, seemed to engulf her, each garment a reminder that she was trying and failing to step into a role that was never hers. Ethan had barely spoken to her in the days that followed. He was present, always present in the penthouse, but it was as though he was a man adrift, a stranger in his own home. He would pass by her in the hallways, his gaze fleeting, his expression closed off, and yet there was something in his silence that pierced through her. She could see the depth of his grief, the way it pulled at him like an anchor he couldn't quite escape. But there was more than that. His sorrow was complicated by something else, something that had begun to pull at Taylor's own heart in the quiet moments when they found themselves alone. She had never expected this, never expected that. In the midst of her grief for Clara, she would find herself struggling with an unspoken longing, a tenderness that seemed to form between her and Ethan, despite everything. She had known him for years. He had been Clara's husband, the man she had watched from the sidelines with a kind of quiet admiration. But now his grief was an invitation pulling her closer to him in ways she wasn't ready for. It wasn't that she wanted to be near him in that way, not yet, but the emotions that swirled between them, unspoken and electric, were undeniable. The way his eyes would linger on her for a moment too long, when she wasn't looking, the way his presence seemed to fill the room without him even speaking. There was a bond forming between them, one that neither of them had sought, yet both of them felt. It was a strange thing to feel this ache for someone who was still mourning someone else. Taylor would catch herself thinking about Ethan in quiet moments, about how his hair had begun to grow longer since Clara's passing, how his broad shoulders seemed more hunched as though the weight of the world rested on them. She thought about how he would sit at the grand piano late at night, his fingers brushing over the keys with such gentleness, as though he were trying to coax out the music from his heart. One evening after dinner, the two of them sat on the balcony. The city's lights twinkled below the skyline, stretching endlessly in front of them. Emma had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day of school and play, and the silence between Taylor and Ethan was both comfortable and heavy. Taylor had taken up the habit of sitting with him most nights, the quiet companionship a balm for the deep, unspoken sorrow that hung in the air. Ethan took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze cast toward the city. "I never thought it would end this way," he said quietly, his voice rough as though the words cost him something. Taylor glanced over at him, her heart aching for him. "None of us did," she murmured. The silence between them stretched for a long while. There was a vulnerability in Ethan's expression now, a rawness that had been absent in the days following Clara's death. It was as though for the first time he was letting the grief inside him rise to the surface, no longer fighting it. I didn't want her to go, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I wasn't ready. I should have done more. I should have. He didn't finish the sentence, and neither of them spoke for a while. Taylor understood. She understood the guilt that he carried, the feeling of helplessness that came with losing someone so close. She had felt it herself. But what could she say to him? How could she comfort him when she was barely holding herself together? I should have been there with her, Ethan continued, his words coming faster now, as though he couldn't hold them back. She needed me and I wasn't there. I couldn't save her. Taylor reached out instinctively, her hand covering his in the space between them. She didn't speak, didn't offer any hollow words of comfort. Instead, she gave him the only thing she had left to give, her presence. I'm here, Ethan, she whispered, her voice softer than she had meant it to be. I'm here and I won't leave. We'll get through this. Together. There it was again, the bond that had begun to form between them, a connection that neither of them had sought, but both of them needed. In that moment, sitting on the balcony with the cool night air around them, Taylor felt the weight of her promise settling deep within her. She would stay. She would stay for Emma, for Ethan, for herself. But even as she made that decision, something shifted within her. It wasn't just the need to protect. It wasn't just the drive to keep everything intact for Emma's sake. It was something else, something deeper and more confusing. Taylor had never intended to find herself in this position. She hadn't expected to be a mother to Emma, or a surrogate partner to Ethan, or a caretaker of the home Clara had built. But there in that moment, she realized she had already started to live a life that wasn't hers. The thought was like a whisper in her mind, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing day. She was beginning to become someone else entirely, and somehow she wasn't sure whether she was losing herself or finding her place in the world. It was a new reality, one she hadn't anticipated, one she didn't know how to navigate. But one thing was certain, it was a reality she had to face for better or worse. The days continued their steady march, and with each passing morning, the weight of responsibility grew heavier on Taylor's shoulders. At first, it had been the little things: taking Emma to school, picking up her toys, reading her stories at bedtime. These were tasks that, while monumental in the emotional sense, were familiar to anyone who had ever cared for a child. But as the days blurred together, a deeper, more unspoken burden began to settle in. It wasn't just about being there for Emma anymore. It wasn't just about filling in the gaps left by Clara's absence. It was something more intangible, more suffocating. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now seemed like an elaborate stage set for a life that had been interrupted, where everyone was playing their part, but no one could quite settle into the roles they had been thrust into. The polished floors and elegant furniture, the perfect arrangement of every room, nothing felt quite right. The silence between Ethan and Taylor was the most disconcerting of all. She had expected grief to make itself known through weeping, through angry outbursts, through broken silences. But instead it had manifested itself in a numbing stillness. Ethan, who had always been a man of action, had become a man of inaction. He existed in the spaces between their conversations, his eyes often clouded with thoughts he never shared, his movements slow and hesitant. He was not the man Taylor had once known. He was someone else entirely. And yet, despite the distance between them, Taylor couldn't help but notice the way his presence seemed to fill the space in ways that both soothed and unsettled her. In the quiet moments, like when they found themselves alone in the kitchen, or when she caught his gaze across the room, she saw something raw, something vulnerable. It was the kind of grief that stretched across a lifetime, the kind that left marks on a man's soul that would never quite fade. But it was more than grief. It was a man torn between what he had lost and what he had left behind. One evening after Emma had gone to bed, Taylor found herself standing at the balcony window, gazing out at the city skyline. The city that had once been her playground now felt like a foreign landscape. She had always dreamed of being here, of carving out a place for herself in this world of glass and steel. But now, with Clara's absence echoing through every corner of their lives, the city felt less like a dream and more like a cage. The lights below flickered like distant stars, mocking her with their brightness, as her own world remained dim and uncertain. Ethan's voice broke the stillness, low and hesitant. "You should get some rest, Taylor." She turned toward him, the soft, familiar weight of his concern pulling at something deep inside her. It had been a long day, her patience worn thin with Emma's quiet sadness and Ethan's increasing distance. "I'm fine," she replied, offering a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I just, I can't stop thinking about everything. About Clara. About Emma." "I know," Ethan said, his voice so quiet that it almost didn't reach her. He had crossed the room, standing now just a few feet away, his presence, a subtle weight in the air. "I think about her, too. Every day. I don't know how to stop." Taylor swallowed the lump that had risen in her throat. She had never been good with words, never been able to offer the comfort that others seemed to know how to give so easily. But in this moment, in the quiet of the night, she felt the pressure of it all, of being the one to pick up the pieces, of being the one to hold everything together. "We'll figure it out," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We have to." Ethan's gaze softened, and for a moment it was as though the world around them fell away. The weight of his grief seemed to lift just for an instant, and in that moment it felt as though they were two people again, not a man and a woman caught in the currents of fate. His hand moved slowly toward hers, a gentle gesture, but one that carried with it the weight of everything unspoken. Taylor could feel the intensity in his touch, the longing that was buried beneath his sorrow, the connection that had always been there even when it was buried beneath the surface. But then, as if realizing what was happening, Ethan pulled back. The moment shattered like glass, and the walls between them rebuilt themselves with an invisible, unspoken force. "I'm sorry," he murmured, as if ashamed of the fleeting connection they had shared. Taylor nodded, the bitter taste of rejection settling in her chest. "It's okay." But it wasn't okay, not really. The pressure was beginning to suffocate her. She had given everything she had to keep things together, to be the strong one, for Emma to be the calm in Ethan's storm. But where was her release? Where was the space for her grief, for her own sorrow? The silence between them had become a kind of unspoken agreement, a place where they both held their pain in check, afraid to disrupt the delicate balance they had created in their shared suffering. The next morning, the routine resumed. Emma, with her soft brown eyes and quiet demeanor, needed Taylor's attention. Ethan, too, needed her, though he would never say it. The days bled together in a blur of meals. Prepared paperwork, shuffled phone calls made everything that needed to be done to keep the house running smoothly. There was no time for her to think about herself, to allow her own grief to surface. There was only the relentless march of the days, each one passing, with the weight of responsibility heavy on her heart. Yet as she stood by the kitchen counter watching Emma play with her dollhouse in the corner of the room, Taylor couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her was slowly dying. The woman she had been, strong, independent, free, was slipping away, and in her place a shadow of that woman remained. She had become a caretaker, a protector, a mother figure. But who was she now? What was left of the woman who had dreamed of more? Who had arrived in New York with her heart full of ambition and a mindset on carving out her own path? She missed Clara more deeply than she had allowed herself to admit. She missed her sister's strength, her laughter, her ability to make everything seem easy, even in the hardest of times. Clara had been the one to hold the family together, the one who had been so effortlessly poised in the face of every challenge. And now, with Clara gone, Taylor had taken on that mantle, but it wasn't her mantle to carry. She wasn't Clara. She couldn't be. And yet the pressure was still there, still mounting with each passing day. She wasn't just caring for Emma or supporting Ethan. She was becoming Clara. She was becoming someone else entirely, a person she had never known and never wanted to be. That night, when Emma had fallen asleep, Taylor found herself standing on the balcony once more, her hands resting on the cool glass railing as she gazed out at the city below. The weight of everything, the grief, the responsibility, the silence between her and Ethan seemed to press down on her, suffocating her in ways she couldn't articulate. Her heart ached with a longing she didn't understand. She had given so much of herself to others that there was nothing left. The realization hit her hard like a wave crashing against the shore. She wasn't just living in someone else's life. She was losing her own. And the pressure of it all, of becoming a stranger in her own skin, was more than she could bear. The city below shimmered oblivious to the turmoil within her. And in that moment, Taylor realized that something had to change. She couldn't keep living like this, holding everything together for everyone else. She had to find herself again, or else she would be lost forever in the shadows of the woman she was trying to replace. The question was, where would she find the strength to do that? The days had turned into weeks, and in that time, Taylor's world had become a delicate balance between the life she had known and the one she was slowly being forced to accept. The penthouse with its sprawling views and polished surfaces felt increasingly distant. It was as though she was living in a house made of glass, fragile and transparent, with every moment of grief and joy reflected back at her. And yet, despite the beauty that surrounded her, it was as though the warmth had been drained from it all. The home had lost its heart, and she was the one left to try and give it new life. In the quiet moments, Taylor would stand by the window, staring out at the city that stretched before her, feeling as if the whole world was moving on, leaving her behind. But it wasn't just the city she couldn't connect to. It was herself. She had become a stranger in her own skin, caught between the duty she had assumed and the life she had once lived. A mother to a niece who was too young to understand the depths of grief, a partner to a man who was too broken to offer her anything in return, Taylor had found herself trapped in the roles she had not chosen. She had promised Clara, her twin sister, that she would look after Emma, and for that promise, she had given up everything. The future that had seemed so clear to her, the dream she had once carried with pride, now felt like a distant memory, a dream that had slipped through her fingers before she could fully grasp it. Clara had always been the one with the light, the one who had commanded every room she entered, the one who had known how to love without restraint. But now it was Taylor who was left with the pieces, trying to hold the world together, to be everything for everyone. And with each passing day, she could feel herself fading, her own light dimming in the shadows of her sister's absence. One late afternoon, as the rain began to fall in sheets against the windows, Taylor found herself alone in Clara's bedroom. The heavy curtains were drawn, casting the room in a soft, muted light, and the scent of Clara's perfume still lingered in the air. It was as if her sister had never left. Taylor ran her fingers over the desk where Clara had written her notes, her designs, her dreams. Everything seemed frozen in time, caught in the final moments of a life that had been taken too soon. It was then that she noticed the leather-bound journal half hidden beneath a stack of papers on the desk. Clara's handwriting, so fluid and graceful, was unmistakable on the cover, and Taylor's heart skipped a beat as she reached for it. She opened it slowly, reverently, and began to read. The words were not what she expected. They were not filled with the carefree thoughts of a woman who had everything. They were filled with the quiet tremor of a mother's love, a love that had seen her child grow and her life unfold with grace and joy. Clara had written her final thoughts, her final wishes for her family, for the future, for the life she had always wanted for Emma. Taylor's breath caught in her throat as she read the familiar words, words that had been written with the same care and attention Clara had always shown in everything she did. If something were to happen to me, if fate were to take me before I can finish raising my daughter, I ask only one thing of you. Please take care of Emma. She is the light of my life, and I cannot bear the thought of her growing up without love, without the warmth of family around her. You, Taylor, are the one person I trust with her heart. I know that you will protect her as I have, that you will love her as I have loved her. And I know that you will help Ethan too. He is lost without me, but I believe in your strength and your heart. Together you will rebuild what we have lost. Please tell Emma that her mother loves her always. The words seemed to hang in the air like a whisper, the final echoes of a voice that was now forever gone. Taylor's eyes blurred with tears as she pressed the page to her chest, feeling the weight of the promise she had made to her sister. This was not just a plea. It was a request from the deepest part of Clara's soul, a request for Taylor to become something she had never imagined. She had always been the one to support, to stand in the background, never the one to carry the weight of the family. But now Clara had given her this burden, this responsibility to care for Emma, to guide Ethan through the labyrinth of his grief, to rebuild a family shattered by loss. The rain outside grew heavier, the steady beat against the windows, matching the rhythm of Taylor's heart. She could feel the pressure of Clara's words settling over her like a mantle. It was a mantle she had not asked for, but it was one she could not shrug off. Clara's last wish was now her reality, and there was no turning back. Taylor had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to make her own choices and carve her own path. But now, standing in Clara's room with the heavy weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest, she realized that her path had changed. She was no longer the woman she had been. She was no longer the carefree woman who had come to New York with dreams of her own. She was now someone else, a guardian, a protector, a mother. And in the silence of the room, as she held Clara's journal close to her heart, she realized that this was a role she had to embrace no matter the cost. In the distance, she heard footsteps in the hallway, the soft sound of Ethan's shoes against the hardwood floor. He had been distant lately, lost in his own grief, but there was something in the way he moved now, a quiet, fragile strength that spoke to the man he could still be. She didn't know how to reach him, how to break through the wall of guilt and sorrow he had built around himself. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't do it alone. As Ethan entered the room, he paused, his gaze lingering on Taylor, who still held the journal to her chest. There was a long moment of silence between them, heavy with everything they hadn't said. Ethan's eyes were dark with the weight of his own grief, but there was something else in them now, something softer, something that hinted at the possibility of healing. "I didn't know," he said softly, his voice hoarse from too many sleepless nights. "I didn't know she wrote this." Taylor nodded, her throat tight. "She wrote it a few weeks before the accident. I didn't know either. But I promised her, Ethan. I promised her I would take care of Emma. That's what she wanted. That's what she needed." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "And what do you need, Taylor?" His voice was so quiet that it almost felt like a confession. "What do you need to make this bearable?" The question hung in the air between them. More than just words, it was a plea, a silent invitation for Taylor to admit what she had been refusing to acknowledge. The unspoken tension between them, the connection that had grown over the past weeks, pulsed in the silence. Taylor didn't know how to answer. She didn't know what she needed. She only knew that she had to keep going for Clara, for Emma, for Ethan, and perhaps most of all, for herself. "I need to believe it's possible," Taylor whispered, her eyes meeting his. "I need to believe that we can rebuild. Together." Ethan's gaze softened, and for a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed as if the weight of their shared grief might finally begin to lift. The future was uncertain, a road that had yet to be paved, but there in that moment, Taylor realized that she wasn't walking it alone. And as the rain continued to fall outside, as the world seemed to pause in its relentless rush, Taylor knew that Clara's last wish was not just a promise, it was a lifeline, one she would hold on to no matter the cost. The apartment was quiet again, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. It had been 3 weeks since Clara's death, and although the calendar kept turning, the days seemed to have lost their meaning. The world outside continued its ceaseless motion, but inside the walls of the penthouse, time seemed to stand still, as though the grief that clung to every corner of the room was too heavy for anything to move forward. Taylor sat at the grand desk in Clara's office, her fingers tapping restlessly on the edge of a folder she had been staring at for hours. It was a mix of business proposals, client meetings, and financial statements, things Clara had handled with effortless grace before she was taken from them. Now it was Taylor who had to manage them, though she felt ill-equipped. She wasn't a businesswoman. She wasn't even sure how she had become the person responsible for picking up the pieces of a life that didn't belong to her. But Clara had left behind more than just memories and keepsakes. She had left behind an empire, an interior design business that was known for its refinement, its artistry, its touch. Taylor had known her sister's work intimately, had admired it from the shadows, but now she was expected to step into Clara's shoes and continue her legacy. The task was daunting, more so than she had ever imagined. But it wasn't just the business that weighed on Taylor. It was Ethan. The man she had always known as strong, decisive, and unyielding in his focus was now a shadow of himself. He had withdrawn into a cocoon of guilt, one that he refused to acknowledge even as it consumed him. The business had faltered under his hands, the weight of Clara's death dragging him down, and Taylor knew that if she didn't step in soon, they would both be lost in the sea of neglect. Yet as she stared at the figures on the page, clients waiting for responses, contractors eager to begin new projects, she felt a strange sense of helplessness. She didn't belong here. This wasn't her world. This wasn't her passion. Clara had built something beautiful, something full of life, and now Taylor was asked to breathe life back into it. But how could she when her own heart felt so empty? Ethan's footsteps broke her reverie. She looked up just as he entered the room, his face weary, his eyes clouded with thoughts he hadn't shared with anyone. "You're still at it," he observed, his voice low, almost apologetic. Taylor nodded, pushing the papers aside as though they had become too much to bear. "There's a lot to catch up on," she said, her voice sounding more like an excuse than a statement of fact. "The clients are waiting for updates. The business isn't going to run itself." Ethan's gaze flickered briefly to the papers before returning to her. "I'm not asking you to do it alone, Taylor," he said quietly, his tone tinged with a mixture of guilt and resolve. "I know I should be doing more, but I just can't. Not yet." Taylor sighed and stood walking over to the large window that looked out onto the skyline, her reflection merging with the city's bright lights in the glass. "I don't know how to do this, Ethan," she confessed, her voice catching in her throat. "This business, this life. I've never done anything like this before. I'm not Clara." Ethan's footsteps approached slowly, and she could feel his presence behind her, like a weight she both resented and needed. "You're doing it because she asked you to," he said softly. "Because we both know she trusted you. She trusted you with everything." The words stung, but they also settled deep within her, like a wound she had tried to ignore. Clara had always trusted her. She had always known that Taylor was the one person who would pick up the pieces when things fell apart. But Taylor wasn't sure she could. Not this time. Not with everything that was at stake. "I don't know if I can do it," Ethan, Taylor murmured, her voice low and vulnerable. "I don't know how to be both the person who holds everything together and the person who still has her own life to live." There was a pause, a moment of silence that stretched between them. Ethan stepped closer, and Taylor could feel the heat of his presence, even as she kept her back to him. The quiet tension, the space between them, that had been there since Clara's death was palpable. But in that moment, she felt something shift, a subtle change in the air and the way he moved toward her, as though he had made a decision. "I don't expect you to be Clara Taylor," Ethan said, his voice low, his breath steady. "I don't expect you to carry everything for me, but you don't have to do this alone." Taylor turned to face him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, their eyes met, really met. There was no longer the distance that had plagued their interactions, no longer the painful silence that spoke louder than words. There was only the raw, unspoken understanding between them. The weight of their grief, of their shared loss, seemed to recede in that instant. "I don't know how to fix this," Taylor whispered, her voice trembling, "but I can't watch it all fall apart either. I I don't know if I'm the right person to take Clara's place, but I'll try. I'll try for her, for you, for Emma." Ethan took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. And in that moment, Taylor felt as if she were standing on the edge of something both terrifying and beautiful. She had taken on the role of protector, of caretaker, of everything Clara had once been, but she had never once stopped to ask herself what she needed, what she wanted, until now. "Thank you, Ethan," said, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't know how much that means to me." Taylor shook her head, the emotions swirling within her like a storm. I don't know if I can do it, Ethan. I'm so tired. His hand reached out gently, hesitantly, as if afraid she would pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she allowed him to touch her arm, his fingers warm and steady, grounding her in the moment. You're not alone. He repeated, his voice soft but firm. We'll do this together. For a long time, they stood there in silence, the weight of their shared grief a constant hum beneath their words, beneath their actions. But in that silence, something else began to grow. A fragile hope, the kind of hope that only arose when two people finally acknowledged their mutual pain and decided to face it together. And for the first time since Clara's death, Taylor felt the weight of responsibility not as a burden, but as something she could bear. It wasn't just her promise to Clara anymore. It was something bigger. It was her promise to herself, to Ethan, and to Emma. She would help them heal. She would rebuild what had been broken. But she couldn't do it alone. As the hours passed, they worked together side by side, poring over business plans, reestablishing contact with clients, making phone calls that had been left unanswered for too long. It was small progress, but it was progress nonetheless. And in that small progress, Taylor began to realize something important. She wasn't alone anymore. Not in this. Not in life. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small breath of relief. Things weren't fixed, but they were moving forward. Together. The steady tick of the clock echoed through the dimly lit office, its rhythmic sound almost maddening in the silence that had settled between them. The penthouse, so full of life before Clara's passing, now seemed a mausoleum for all that had been lost. Even the air felt heavier, as though it too carried the burden of unspoken grief swirling in the corners of the rooms, curling around the edges of the furniture, refusing to let go. Taylor sat at Clara's desk, the papers before her, a stark reminder of the life her sister had built. She had spent countless hours going through them, sorting, organizing, and filing. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Clara's absence weighed on her in ways she hadn't expected, but there was more to the tension in the air than simple grief. There was a hidden pressure, a sense of unease that had been growing since she began to take over Clara's work. As she flipped through the latest business proposals, high-end interior designs for luxury clients, new partnerships and expansion plans, Taylor's eyes paused on a particular file. It was buried deep beneath the stack, its folder out of place, a stark contrast to the polished presentations that surrounded it. The edges of the manila folder were frayed, as though it had been opened and closed many times, as if someone had been afraid to look inside, but felt compelled to do so anyway. Her heart skipped a beat, a strange sense of foreboding creeping up her spine. Something about this felt wrong. She opened the folder slowly, her breath held as she scanned the contents. At first, it seemed like just another set of contracts, invoices, and client meetings. But as she continued to sift through the papers, a particular document caught her eye. A list of names, a series of transactions that didn't quite add up. Large sums of money moved from one account to another, and a few names stood out, people Taylor didn't recognize, companies she had never heard of. The dates were recent, and the numbers, they were disturbingly high. Her stomach tightened as she felt the pieces begin to fall into place. This wasn't just paperwork. This wasn't just about running a business. There was something more here, something hidden. The name that stood out among the others was Celeste Sinclair, the name she had been hearing more and more often since Clara's death. Ethan's mother, the woman whose icy gaze had never quite left Taylor's mind since their first meeting. There had always been something off about her, something cold, calculating in the way she held herself. But this was something darker, something more insidious. Taylor leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had always respected Clara's business sense, but Clara had kept her personal life, her family life separate from the world of design. It had always been her way. She had worked hard to keep her personal life private to shield her family from the pressure of business dealings. But now with Clara gone, those barriers had begun to break down, revealing a side of things Taylor had never known existed. Her fingers trembled as she ran them over the papers. A thought tugged at her consciousness, one she couldn't quite ignore. What if Clara had known? What if she had discovered something too late? The sudden thought made her stomach lurch. She couldn't ignore it any longer. There were secrets behind closed doors, secrets that had been carefully concealed in the glossy exterior of Clara's business. And now with Clara gone, it was up to Taylor to uncover them. She sat there, her mind whirling, the weight of the discovery heavy in her chest. The realization settled in slowly. Celeste Sinclair had been siphoning money from Clara's business. That was the connection. That was the secret. But what did it mean? And why had Clara never said anything? Had she known, or had she been blindsided too, just like everyone else? The questions swirled, unanswered and haunting. Taylor didn't have long to linger in these thoughts. The door to the office creaked open and she looked up to see Ethan standing there, his tired eyes meeting hers with an unreadable expression. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. His gaze flickered briefly to the papers spread out in front of her. Taylor quickly shut the folder, her mind still racing. "Yeah," she said, forcing a smile, though it felt brittle on her lips. "Just sorting through some of Clara's files, trying to get a handle on everything." Ethan nodded, though there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. He walked into the room, his presence filling the space between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Taylor felt the pull of his grief again, the heavy silence that seemed to hang between them, the emotional distance that had grown ever since Clara's death. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, his voice soft but determined. "Maybe we should have a meeting with the contractors tomorrow. Get everything on track again." Clara would have wanted that. Taylor nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. "Yes, that sounds like a good idea." Her voice came out hollow, distant, as if the words weren't truly her own. Ethan gave her a faint smile, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled her, a tiredness that went beyond mere exhaustion. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Taylor," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The words caught her off guard, and for a moment her breath hitched. She had always been there for Ethan, but this felt different. There was a tenderness in his tone, an unspoken understanding that seemed to settle between them. He was lost, and she was the one holding on, the one keeping the pieces together. But at what cost? Before she could respond, Ethan turned away, his footsteps heavy as he made his way to the door. Taylor watched him go, her heart heavy with the weight of the unspoken connection that lingered between them. She knew he needed her just as much as she needed him, but there was a distance that couldn't be crossed. Not yet. Once the door clicked shut behind him, Taylor sat back down, her fingers trembling as she opened the folder again. She scanned the documents one more time, her mind racing as she pieced together the fragments of a much larger picture. Celeste Sinclair had been siphoning funds from Clara's business, hiding money in various accounts, working through shell companies and accounts that no one seemed to notice. And now the thought gnawed at Taylor, how deep did this go? Was it just about the money, or was there something more? Her heart pounded in her chest, but she knew what she had to do. She couldn't just sit back and ignore this. Not now. Not when Clara's death had opened the door to something so much darker. The business of healing, Taylor realized, was not just about putting things back together. It was about facing the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And the truth was out there, hidden behind the closed doors of the life Clara had built, buried under layers of deception and lies. Taylor didn't know what she would find, but she knew she had to uncover it. For Clara, for Ethan, and most of all for herself. The night had fallen heavy with the kind of stillness that only existed in the wake of the storm, a silence so profound it seemed to settle over the entire city, wrapping the world in an invisible shroud. Taylor sat in the living room, the large windows casting the faintest light from the street lamps outside her fingers, tracing the rim of the wine glass in front of her. She didn't remember pouring the drink, didn't remember standing in the kitchen to fetch it. She just knew that it had become a habit, this quiet routine she had begun to follow each evening, pouring herself something to calm her nerves, something to dull the sharp edge of the anxiety that gripped her heart in the quiet moments between tasks. Her gaze flickered to the corner of the room where the empty armchair stood in its place, an unused throne in a room where a family once lived, where Clara's laughter once echoed. But now the room was devoid of the warmth it had once held, and in its place was a hollowness that felt suffocating. Ethan had been quieter than usual that evening, which given the circumstances was saying something. He had retreated into his study for hours, only emerging when dinner was ready, his eyes heavy with fatigue, his movements slow, as if every step carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. Taylor had learned not to press him, had learned that silence was sometimes the only thing he could offer. But tonight, something in her shifted. She couldn't keep holding everything in, couldn't keep pretending that it would all work out in time. She needed answers, needed something, anything, to break the oppressive silence that had settled between them. Her fingers brushed against the pages of Clara's journal, its worn leather cover sitting on the coffee table in front of her, untouched for days. Taylor had read it over and over, the words seeping into her heart with every turn of the page. Clara's final wish, the promise she had made to her sister, was the thread that had kept her grounded. But tonight it felt like a weight she could no longer bear alone. She needed to know that Ethan would be there. She needed to know that they weren't just surviving, but living. And as if the universe had heard her, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light from the hallway. There was something different about him tonight, something almost urgent in the way he moved toward her. Taylor, he said her name quietly, as if testing it, as if it were something foreign to him, yet so familiar. His voice was deep-threaded with a quiet intensity. "We need to talk." Taylor put down the glass, the soft clink of crystal, the only sound between them. She felt the tension, the years of unspoken emotions hanging like a weight in the air. She nodded, though her heart raced in her chest. She had no idea what he was about to say, but she had the feeling that this moment, this conversation, would change everything. "I know you've been shouldering more than your fair share." Ethan began, his words carefully chosen, as if he had rehearsed them. "And I know you've been carrying Clara's legacy in ways that weren't asked of you. I see how hard you're trying to keep it all together, and it's not right. You shouldn't have to do it all on your own." Taylor swallowed the lump in her throat, growing. "I'm just doing what I promised Clara I would," she said softly, though the words felt foreign, heavy. "But it's more than I ever imagined it would be. Ethan, I can't keep pretending that it's not tearing me apart. I don't know if I'm the person who's supposed to fix everything. I don't know if I'm the person who's supposed to carry it all." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers, and for the first time in weeks, Taylor saw him not as the man who had lost everything, but as the man who was still standing, still fighting. "You don't have to carry it all." "Taylor," he said, his voice low, his words resonating with an honesty she hadn't expected. "You don't have to be everything to everyone. You never had to be Clara. You just have to be you." His words, simple as they were, seemed to cut through the fog of grief and responsibility that had clouded her mind. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged the impossible weight she had been carrying, the weight of a promise, the weight of a life she had never chosen for herself. Her breath caught in her chest as Ethan reached for her hand, his fingers brushing gently against hers. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Taylor let herself lean into the touch, let herself feel the warmth of his presence. The tension that had bound them together, unspoken and unresolved, seemed to melt away, leaving only the raw, unfiltered emotion that lay beneath. "I know this hasn't been easy," Ethan continued, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "And I'm not asking you to be my wife or my savior, but I need you, Taylor. I need you to help me rebuild, help me get through this. I need you by my side." The words were simple, but they landed in Taylor's heart like a hammer striking an anvil. There in his eyes she saw not just the grief that had weighed him down, but something more, something she hadn't dared to believe existed between them. Hope. The kind of hope that comes not from promises, but from the knowledge that two people can find their way back to each other even when the world around them is broken. And in that moment, standing in the quiet glow of the living room, Taylor felt the walls around her begin to crumble. She was no longer just the caretaker. She was no longer just a woman living in the shadow of her sister's memory. She was someone who could be loved not as a replacement for Clara, not as a substitute, but as herself. Ethan's hand tightened around hers, and the quiet intensity in his gaze made her heart skip a beat. He didn't pull away, didn't look for answers from anyone else. He looked at her, his eyes soft but firm as though he had already made up his mind. "I can't promise you everything," Ethan whispered, his voice low and intimate. "But I can promise you this. I will love you, Taylor. I will love you for as long as I'm able, and I'll do everything I can to help you rebuild your own life. We'll do this together." Taylor felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She didn't have to. For the first time, she understood that her pain wasn't something she had to carry alone. And just like that, in the space between the two of them, a new kind of bond began to form, a bond born not out of necessity or obligation, but out of love. As the moments stretched into eternity, Ethan slowly lowered himself to one knee, his eyes never leaving hers, and Taylor's breath caught in her chest. The suddenness of it, the rawness, the tenderness of the gesture took her by surprise. "I know it's too soon," he said quietly, his words full of conviction. "But I can't imagine my life without you in it. I can't imagine facing the future without knowing that you're by my side." Taylor's pulse quickened, her heart racing, as she tried to process the moment. It wasn't just the ring he was offering. It was the promise of a future. A future that wasn't about the past, wasn't about Clara, but about the two of them, together. "Will you marry me, Taylor?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but filled with a sincerity that stole her breath away. For a long moment, Taylor stood frozen, her mind reeling. She had never expected this moment, never imagined that the man who had once been her brother-in-law, the man who had lost everything, would offer her this. But as she looked into his eyes, saw the vulnerability, the hope, the love that was finally free of grief, something inside her shifted. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking as she fell to her knees beside him. "Yes, I will." And in that moment, as Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, everything seemed to shift. The pain of the past began to fade, replaced by something brighter, something more certain. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. They were healing. And for the first time since Clara's death, Taylor allowed herself to believe that love, true love, could heal even the deepest wounds. The days that followed the proposal felt like a quiet reprieve, a breath drawn in after a long, suffocating silence. Taylor could feel the weight of the decision settling over her. There was no turning back now. They were moving forward together with the promise of a future that had once seemed impossible. But with that promise came a weight she hadn't anticipated, a burden she wasn't sure she was ready to bear. Ethan's words, the tenderness in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes had filled her with hope. Yes, but they also unearthed something deeper within her, something raw and unresolved. The love that had begun to bloom between them felt like a fragile thing, too delicate to withstand the weight of their shared grief, too tender to grow without time and space to heal. But Ethan hadn't given her that space. He hadn't asked for it either. In the quiet moments when they were together, the tenderness of his touch, the closeness between them seemed almost too much to bear. He had become everything she had been afraid of, too much too soon. His presence too overwhelming, his need for her too strong. Every time their eyes met, every time he reached for her hand, Taylor could feel the pressure building between them, an unspoken tension she couldn't escape. It wasn't that she didn't care for him, she did more than she cared to admit. It was that she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to slip into this role of being his partner, his confidant, his lover. She had spent so much time taking care of Emma, taking care of the business, taking care of everything, that when it came to herself, she felt like a ghost in her own life. Who was she in all of this? Was she Clara's replacement, the caretaker of the family? Or was she Taylor, the woman who had been lost in the storm of responsibility, the woman who still had her own dreams, her own desires, her own life? Taylor's breath caught as she stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. The engagement ring, Ethan's mother's ring, sparkled in the dim light, a reminder of everything she had agreed to, everything that had changed in the blink of an eye. She touched it softly, her fingers tracing the delicate curve of the band, but it felt like a symbol of something she hadn't fully understood yet. What had she agreed to? What had she truly promised? The soft sound of footsteps behind her brought her out of her reverie, and she turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, a quiet intensity in his gaze. He had been so distant lately, his eyes clouded with thoughts he hadn't shared, his silence, a constant presence between them. There were times when she felt as if they were two strangers living under the same roof, bound by nothing but grief and obligation. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, almost tentative. Taylor forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine, just thinking." Ethan studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp as though he could see through her facade. About what he asked, stepping closer, his proximity both comforting and unnerving. She hesitated, the words caught in her throat. She had never been good at talking about her feelings, not when it came to love, not when it came to the things that really mattered. She had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together, but now in the face of Ethan's quiet intensity, she felt as though she were being peeled open layer by layer. "I don't know, Ethan," she said quietly, her voice trembling despite herself. "I don't know if I'm ready for this. For us." His expression softened, though there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something like confusion. Like he hadn't expected her to say this, hadn't expected her to question them so openly. But the tension between them was palpable, like a crack in the foundation of a building they were both trying to hold up. Ethan reached for her hand, his fingers warm against her skin, and Taylor allowed herself to lean into his touch, even as she felt a twinge of resistance. "I know it's been fast," he said, his voice gentle, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "I know you're still dealing with everything. I need you, Taylor. I need to know that you're with me, that we're in this together." Her heart ached at the vulnerability in his words, at the rawness that had always been beneath his surface, waiting to be seen. But even as she felt that tenderness, even as she longed to comfort him, there was a part of her that pulled away, that wanted to retreat into herself. She couldn't be everything he needed her to be, not yet. She couldn't give him the kind of love he was asking for, not when she didn't even know who she was in all of this. "I'm trying, Ethan," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I don't know if I'm enough for you. I don't know if I can be the person you need me to be." Ethan's hand tightened around hers, his grip firm but gentle. "You don't have to be perfect, Taylor. You don't have to have it all figured out. I just need to know that you're here, that you're not going to shut me out." But she was shutting him out. She knew she was. And the more he tried to draw her in, the more she pulled away. It was as though the space between them had become too large to cross, the emotional divide between them, too vast to bridge with mere words or gestures. "I'm not shutting you out," Taylor said, the words coming out more sharply than she intended. I'm just, I'm just not ready to be what you want me to be. Not yet." There was a long pause as Ethan absorbed her words, as though he were trying to make sense of them, trying to understand what she was really saying. His face hardened, the vulnerability that had been there moments ago, replaced by something else, something unreadable, something that made her heart tighten in her chest. "I don't know what you want me to say, Taylor," he said finally, his voice rough, his eyes dark. "I can't keep going like this. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not. I'm lost without you, and I don't know how much more I can take." His words cut through her like a knife. But they were the truth. She knew it. She could feel it in the way her chest tightened, in the way her breath caught in her throat. She had been so focused on holding it all together, on carrying the weight of their grief, that she had forgotten the one thing that had brought them together in the first place: love. But love wasn't just about duty or promises. Love was about connection, about giving and receiving, about being vulnerable enough to stand in the face of uncertainty and still reach for each other. But what if she couldn't do that? What if she wasn't ready to give him what he needed? What if she wasn't ready to love him the way he wanted her to? Ethan stepped back, His jaw clenched, his eyes distant. I don't know how to fix this, Taylor. I don't know how to fix us. Taylor watched him, her heart breaking at the sight of him. This man she had loved, this man she had promised to stand by now, standing in front of her so full of grief, so full of fear that he didn't know where to turn. She wanted to reach for him to tell him that it would be okay, that they would figure it out. But she didn't know if it would be okay. She didn't know if they could fix this, if they could move forward when the emotional divide between them seemed so wide. I don't know either, she whispered, her voice trembling. But I'm trying. I promise you I'm trying. And in that moment, as they stood there in the quiet of the living room, both of them so lost in their own worlds of grief and uncertainty, Taylor realized something important. They were both trying, but trying wasn't enough. It would take more than that to bridge the divide between them. It would take time, it would take patience, and it would take a kind of love neither of them had been willing to give until now. But for the first time, Taylor felt the truth in Ethan's words. She wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. She would have to choose to reach out, to let herself be vulnerable enough to love again. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan would be there waiting for her to make that choice. The sky had darkened by the time Ethan entered the penthouse, the heavy clouds pressing down against the windows, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the apartment seemed to echo with the silence that had become all too familiar, a silence that stretched across the rooms like a shadow, thick and oppressive. Taylor stood by the large window in the living room, gazing out at the city's skyline, the dim lights reflecting in the glass, casting faint shadows across her face. She had spent the evening in a kind of numb stillness, her thoughts tangled in a web of confusion and uncertainty. The weight of the decision that had been made, the tension that had built between them over the past few days, it was all too much to bear alone. Ethan's footsteps were quiet as he approached his presence, heavy with the burden of everything he had carried inside. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, the unspoken words hanging between them, like a wall neither could cross. Taylor, he said her name softly, his voice low, almost tentative. We need to talk. Taylor turned slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time that evening. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the weariness that had settled into his features, but there was something else there too, something deeper, something unresolved. About what she asked, her voice strained, though she tried to keep it steady. She didn't want to face it, didn't want to acknowledge the things that had been left unsaid, the things they hadn't dared to discuss. But she knew it was coming. They had both known it was only a matter of time. Ethan's eyes flickered, his hands flexing at his sides as if unsure of what to say next. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. About the business, about what's been going on behind closed doors. Taylor's heart skipped a beat, a cold shiver running down her spine. She had feared this moment. She had feared that the secrets she had uncovered, the hidden truths that had begun to unravel in the wake of Clara's death, would soon come to light. The discovery had been too much to carry on her own, and now Ethan was standing before her, his words cutting through the silence, forcing her to confront the truth they had both been avoiding. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for a manila folder from the desk, his fingers trembling slightly as he placed it in front of her. Taylor's breath caught in her throat as she looked down at the folder. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. She opened it slowly, her fingers brushing over the documents inside. Her stomach turned as she scanned the pages, each one a deeper revelation of betrayal. There were receipts, wire transfers, and legal documents, names she didn't recognize, accounts that shouldn't have been linked. And at the center of it all was Celeste Sinclair, Ethan's mother, the woman who had appeared so composed, so poised in the wake of Clara's death, had been quietly pulling the strings behind the scenes, siphoning money from Clara's business, covering up financial misdeeds with a careful hand. Taylor's heart sank as the weight of the discovery hit her. She had known something was off, known that there were things Clara had never shared with her, but seeing it all laid out before her was another thing entirely. The betrayal ran deeper than she had imagined. Clara had been caught in a web of deceit, and now so were they. Ethan watched her silently, his face unreadable, waiting for her to process the shock, the anger, the disbelief that he knew she must be feeling. But all Taylor could feel was the sharp sting of betrayal. Clara had trusted Celeste, and Celeste had used that trust to line her pockets with money that should have gone to the business, should have gone to the family. "You knew," Taylor said, her voice trembling barely above a whisper. She looked up at Ethan, her heart pounding in her chest. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Ethan's jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck tightening. "I didn't want to believe it," he said, his voice hoarse as though he were struggling to admit it, even to himself. "But when Clara passed, I started going through the books trying to make sense of things, and I found the discrepancies. I didn't want to believe my mother could do something like this. I didn't want to believe she would take advantage of Clara like that." Taylor shook her head, her emotions swirling betrayal, confusion, and a deep sadness that settled in the pit of her stomach. "Ethan, this isn't just about the money. This is about trust, about family. Your mother has been lying to you, to all of us, and you let her. You didn't do anything. You didn't say anything." Ethan flinched as though her words had struck him physically, and for a moment he looked broken, more so than he had in weeks. He ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I thought I was protecting you," he said softly, his voice strained. "I thought I was protecting Emma. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to make things worse." "But you already did," Taylor whispered, the words cutting through the air between them. "You already let her destroy everything. Everything Clara worked for. Everything we worked for." The silence between them was thick, suffocating, and for the first time Taylor felt the weight of it all. The weight of the secrets that had festered, the weight of the lies that had been told. It wasn't just Celeste who had betrayed them. It was the silence that had allowed it to continue, the silence that had built the walls between them, separating them from the truth. "I never wanted this for us," Ethan said, his voice barely audible, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and shame. "I never wanted to drag you into this, Taylor. I never wanted you to be a part of this mess. But it's my mess. It's my family. And I don't know how to fix it." Taylor stared at him for a long moment, her heart torn between anger and compassion. She had loved him in ways she hadn't fully understood until now. But this was beyond forgiveness, beyond what she had expected. She had trusted him. She had trusted him to protect Clara's memory, to keep their family safe. But he had failed them. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Ethan," she said quietly, the words hanging heavily in the air. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this, for what you let happen to Clara." Ethan's face fell, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy cloak. "I didn't want this. I didn't know how to stop it." The room felt colder now, the distance between them widening with every passing second. Taylor had made a promise to Clara, to Emma, that she would protect their family. But now, as she stood before Ethan, the weight of that promise felt like a shackle binding her to a man who had failed them both. "I need time," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to think. I need to figure out what this means." Ethan nodded silently, his face pale, his eyes distant. He didn't try to stop her, didn't try to hold on. There was nothing more to say. As Taylor left the room, the heavy door clicking softly behind her, the penthouse felt even emptier. The family that had once been whole, that had once seemed invincible, was now a fractured shell. And no matter how hard they tried, the cracks that had been exposed would never be the same. The reckoning had come, and with it a truth they could no longer ignore. The weight of the discovery, the treachery of Celeste's manipulation, the lies that had twisted through the fabric of their family still hung heavily in the air. Taylor had spent the past few days avoiding Ethan, giving him the space he had asked for, though neither of them could escape the cold distance that had crept into their relationship. The walls had gone up again, higher than before, and each moment they spent in silence only solidified the divide between them. It was as though every room in the penthouse had become a battlefield, each glance exchanged, each word spoken a reminder of what had been lost and what had been taken. Taylor had never expected the road ahead to be easy. She had stepped into the role Clara had left behind, out of duty, out of love. But as the days stretched into weeks, she felt the subtle fraying of her own identity. The promise she had made to Clara to look after Emma, to protect the business, had become an all-consuming task that left her little room to breathe, let alone reflect on her own needs. Emma had grown quieter since the confrontation with Ethan. The small, cheerful girl who had once filled their home with laughter now spent hours in her room playing alone, her once bright eyes clouded with uncertainty. Taylor couldn't help but feel the sting of her niece's sorrow, the kind of sorrow no child should ever have to experience. She had promised Clara that she would keep Emma safe, that she would help her heal, but Taylor was beginning to realize just how much of her own soul was being drained in the process. As she sat at Clara's desk, sorting through the remaining business matters, the weight of it all pressed in on her chest. There were emails to respond to, invoices to settle, clients to meet with. It had become a routine, an endless list of things to check off, tasks that would never truly bring the healing she had hoped for. The house was still empty of Clara's laughter, still void of the warmth her sister had once effortlessly radiated. And now, with the discovery of Celeste's betrayal, the family had splintered in ways that were impossible to repair. Ethan's absence had become an ache in her life. Though he had promised to stand by her to rebuild with her, Taylor couldn't ignore the fact that he too was lost, lost in guilt, lost in a grief that hadn't yet allowed him to find his way back to her. The tenderness he had once shown, the connection they had shared, was now a distant memory. He had become a shadow of the man she had once known, a man she couldn't fully reach. And the emotional divide between them seemed only to grow wider with each passing day. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door creaking open. Ethan had returned from another one of his long business meetings, meetings that seemed endless yet never produced any real resolution. He was exhausted, his face drawn, his eyes hollow, with the weight of the decisions he had been avoiding. Taylor didn't need to look at him to know he was struggling. She could feel it in the air and the heaviness that lingered whenever he was near. He stepped into the room, his eyes locking with hers, though the tension between them was palpable. The space between them felt like an ocean, and neither of them knew how to bridge it. "Taylor," Ethan said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Can we talk?" She didn't answer immediately, though the question had been hanging in the air for days. There had been no real conversation between them since the confrontation, no words to make sense of the mess they had found themselves in. The business, Celeste's betrayal, the strain between them, it all felt too much to confront at once. But she couldn't run anymore. Not from him, not from the reality they had created together. Taylor nodded, though the decision to speak, to face the truth, felt like a mountain she didn't know how to climb. She set the papers aside, standing to meet his gaze. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weariness of a man who had been carrying a burden far too heavy for one person. And yet, despite everything, she could still see the man she had once admired, the man who had loved her sister, the man who had loved them. And she couldn't help but feel the ache of that loss of the person he had once been. "I'm sorry," Ethan began, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "For everything. For the way things have gone between us. I know I've been distant. I know I've been—" He stopped, his words faltering. "I've been so caught up in my own guilt that I've pushed you away. I didn't mean to. I never wanted to hurt you." Taylor felt her heart twist at the sincerity in his voice, at the vulnerability that he was allowing himself to show her. She had never been one to shy away from difficult conversations, but this felt different. The words felt too heavy, too real. "Ethan, I don't know if I can do this anymore," she said quietly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I don't know if I can keep being the one to hold everything together." The silence between them stretched for a long moment. Ethan didn't speak, but Taylor could see the pain in his eyes, the recognition that she had reached the limit of her strength. "I know," he said softly, his voice breaking the stillness. "I know you're tired. You've been carrying the weight of everything, Emma, the business, our family. And I've been letting you. I've been too afraid to ask for help, Too afraid to ask for anything from you because I didn't want to add to your burden. But I see it now, Taylor. I see how much it's taking from you, and I don't want to do that to you anymore." She shook her head, her breath shallow. "I promised Clara I would keep Emma safe. I promised her I would take care of everything. But I never expected it to be like this. I never expected—" Her voice trailed off, a knot tightening in her chest. "I don't know who I am in all of this anymore. I'm not just taking care of Emma. I'm taking care of you too. And I don't know how much more of this I can give." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze filled with something softer now, something that made her heart ache in ways she hadn't expected. "You've given more than enough, Taylor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given everything, and I haven't been here. I haven't been the one to help you carry it, but I can be now. I will be now. For you, for Emma." Taylor felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart racing as his words sank in. The truth of it all settled between them, heavy and undeniable. The love they had once shared, however fractured, however lost, was still there, still alive in the silence, still lingering in the space between them. But it was a love that required sacrifice, a love that required more than just promises and words. It required action. "I don't know what this means for us," Ethan, Taylor whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if we can fix what's been broken." He reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "We'll figure it out." He said, his voice strong, though his eyes were filled with the same uncertainty she felt. "But we have to do it together. We can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not. We have to face it. We have to face what's been happening to us." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Taylor allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. The road ahead was unclear, filled with obstacles and struggles she hadn't yet begun to understand. But in that moment, with Ethan's hand in hers, she realized that they had a chance to rebuild what had been lost, a chance to heal together. But it would take sacrifice. It would take trust. And it would take a kind of love that neither of them had ever fully given before. The family's reckoning had come, and with it the realization that they would have to choose to rebuild piece by piece, day by day, and that they could not do it alone. Ethan's voice broke the silence, soft and steady. "We'll do this. Together. No matter what." The days that followed the reckoning were marked by a strange kind of limbo. They had come to terms with the truth, the betrayal, the deception, the emotional toll of it all. But even with the truth laid bare, nothing felt settled. Every conversation felt like a delicate dance around the pain they were both holding, the unspoken words that lingered in the air between them, too heavy to be ignored, too raw to be touched. Ethan had promised that they would rebuild together, but the effort to do so felt like an uphill battle, each step forward, mired by doubt, by unresolved grief, by the weight of all that had been broken. Taylor had thrown herself into the business, trying to regain some semblance of control over the chaos that had unraveled in Clara's absence. There were meetings to attend, contracts to sign, clients to reassure, endless tasks that filled her days with distractions, but never quite eased the ache in her chest. Emma, too, needed her. The little girl was more withdrawn than ever, her quiet sadness settling like a permanent shadow over the house. Taylor had tried to be everything Clara had been: a protector, a mother, a guide, but she was beginning to feel as if she were losing herself in the process. And Ethan remained a constant presence, but his distance was palpable. He had tried to make amends, to offer his support, but there was a gap between them that neither of them could bridge. The emotional divide remained like an insurmountable wall, and though they spoke more than they had in the days following Clara's death, the silence in the spaces between their words was deafening. One evening after dinner, Taylor found herself alone in the living room, the quiet of the house pressing in on her. The soft hum of the city below was barely audible, and yet it felt as though the weight of the world had settled around her. She sat on the couch, her eyes unfocused, as she stared at the faint outline of the city skyline outside the window. The engagement ring sparkled faintly on her finger, a constant reminder of the promise she had made to Ethan, to Clara, to herself. But the promise had become more of a chain than a vow. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Ethan entered the room, his presence unmistakable, despite the silence that hung between them. His eyes were tired, the weight of the past weeks visible in every line of his face. "Taylor," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant, as though he were unsure of how to approach her. She didn't respond immediately, but instead her gaze shifted toward the door, as though she could escape the conversation without ever facing it. "I know you've been carrying a lot," he continued, stepping further into the room. "And I can see it. I can see how much this is hurting you." Taylor swallowed hard, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her words. "I'm fine, Ethan. Really." He wasn't fooled. He stepped closer, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "You're not fine. I know you, Taylor. You're shutting me out. You're shutting us out." Her breath hitched, and for a moment she felt the walls that she had carefully built around herself begin to crack. The words had been said so many times before. "We'll get through this together. We'll fix this together." But nothing had changed. They were still standing on opposite sides of an emotional chasm, each too proud or too scared to bridge the distance. "I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice breaking. The tears she had been holding back threatened to spill over, but she didn't allow them to fall. "Not yet. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not. I'm drowning, Ethan." He reached for her, his hand trembling as he cupped her face, lifting her chin gently so that she had to meet his eyes. "I know. I know you are. But I'm here, Taylor. I'm here. And I don't want you to carry it all anymore. I don't want you to feel like you have to protect everyone and still be everything to me." Her heart ached at his words, but the pain was sharp, raw. She pulled away from him, the distance between them growing once more. "You don't understand," she whispered, the tears finally spilling over. "I can't be who you want me to be. I can't be your everything. Not when I've already lost myself." Ethan's eyes filled with unshed tears of his own, the vulnerability that had always been buried beneath the surface breaking free. "I never asked you to be perfect, Taylor," he said, his voice low. "I never asked you to carry all of this on your own. But I need you to let me in. I need you to let me help you." "I can't," she said, shaking her head, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I can't need you, Ethan. Not like this." The finality of her words hung between them like a death sentence. She had built her entire life around being strong, around being the one who held everything together. But now, as she stood there staring into his eyes, eyes that had once been full of love, full of hope, she realized just how much she had sacrificed. She had sacrificed herself, her dreams, her desires, all in the name of family, of duty. And in doing so, she had lost herself completely. "I'm not the same person I was, Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And I don't know if I can ever be her again." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He stepped back as if her admission had physically knocked him off balance. His gaze flickered to the ring on her finger, and for the briefest moment, Taylor saw a flicker of something dark and painful pass through his eyes. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean for you to lose yourself in all of this." Taylor let out a shaky breath, her heart aching with a pain that she couldn't put into words. The love they had shared, the bond they had once built, felt like a distant memory, now something that had been consumed by grief, by guilt, by the weight of everything that had happened. "I don't know how we come back from this, Ethan," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know if we can." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt like the breaking point, like the final crack in the foundation of everything they had built. They were both too broken, too lost in their own pain to find their way back to each other. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice soft but filled with a quiet resolve. "I love you, Taylor. I don't know if that's enough anymore, but it's all I have to give. And I'll keep fighting for us, for you, even if it feels impossible." Taylor nodded, though her heart felt like it was shattering all over again. The love between them, once so strong, now felt like a faint echo of what it had been. And yet, despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to let go. I don't know if I can fight anymore, Ethan. She whispered the words barely audible. I'm too tired. And in that moment, Taylor knew that no matter how much they loved each other, no matter how much they wanted to rebuild, there was a limit, a breaking point, and they had both reached it. The future, once so full of hope, now seemed shrouded in uncertainty. The weight of silence lingered like a storm cloud over the penthouse, pressing in on every corner of the once vibrant space. Days had passed since Taylor's confession, since she had admitted for the first time the truth of her own exhaustion, the truth of how much she had lost in the process of trying to hold everything together. But even as the truth hung between them, neither she nor Ethan had been able to face what was truly at the heart of their unraveling. They had spoken of love, of promises, of rebuilding, but beneath it all, the real story had yet to be told. Ethan had kept his distance after the confrontation, retreating into his work, as if it could offer him some kind of escape from the unraveling threads of their shared grief. Taylor, too, had withdrawn into herself. She spent long hours at Clara's desk, her mind consumed by the business that had once been Clara's passion and now felt like an unshakable burden. Emma, ever the quiet child, had grown even more distant, retreating into herself in a way that Taylor couldn't quite understand. The house had become quieter, colder, as if it too was waiting for something to break the final truth that would bring it all to light. Taylor had hoped that with time things would settle, that maybe with patience, with effort, with space, the pieces would fall into place. But every night as she lay awake, she could feel the ache in her chest, the ache of a family shattered by secrets, by betrayals, and by the fear that they had lost themselves somewhere along the way. And then one evening, the storm finally broke. It was a Friday night. Ethan had come home late from yet another meeting, his face etched with exhaustion. He walked past Taylor without a word, heading straight for his study, the door shutting quietly behind him. It was a routine they had both come to expect. But tonight something felt different. The air was thick with an energy she couldn't place a tension that had been building between them for weeks. Unable to sit in the silence anymore, Taylor stood up from the couch, her movements sharp and deliberate. She crossed the room and knocked lightly on the door of Ethan's study. Ethan, she said, her voice quiet but firm, we need to talk. There was a long pause before he answered. Not now, Taylor, his voice came through the door tight and strained. I'm not ready. I'm not asking, Taylor replied, her hand resting on the door handle. I'm done waiting. The door swung open and Ethan stood there looking every bit the man torn apart by grief and guilt. His eyes were heavy, his face pale, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no facade, no walls between them. Just raw, unfiltered emotion. I know I've been shutting you out, Ethan said quietly, stepping back to let her enter. I know I've been distant, but I don't know how to fix any of this. I don't even know where to start. Taylor didn't sit down. She stood tall, her heart beating wildly in her chest, her mind a whirlwind of everything she had been holding back. The truth, Ethan, she said, her voice trembling, but strong. We need to face the truth. All of it. His eyes flickered with something guilt, fear, maybe even regret. But he didn't speak. He didn't move. It was as if he were waiting for her to say what they both knew had to be said. The one thing they had both avoided, the one thing that had hung over them like a shadow since Clara's death. Taylor took a deep breath and finally let the words spill from her. You knew about the money. You knew about Celeste's betrayal. And you didn't tell me. You didn't tell me because you were too afraid to face it. Too afraid of what it would mean for your family. For us. The words stung sharper than she had expected. It was one thing to think it, to suspect it, but to hear it out loud, to say it to Ethan's face, was another entirely. Ethan's breath caught his expression crumbling into something raw, vulnerable. He looked like he was fighting to keep himself composed, but the truth had finally cracked through the surface. I didn't want to lose you, Taylor, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't want to lose Emma. I didn't want to lose everything. Taylor took a step closer, her heart aching at the brokenness in his voice, but she knew she had to stay strong. But you did lose everything, Ethan. You lost Clara. You lost me. And now we're both paying the price for keeping the truth buried. He flinched at the words as if they were a physical blow. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words failed him, lost in the weight of her accusations. "We can't move forward like this," Ethan Taylor continued, her voice breaking, but her resolve still firm. "I can't be the only one trying to hold this family together. I can't be the only one fighting to fix things. You have to face what happened. You have to face the fact that your mother, your own mother, has been stealing from Clara's legacy, that she was planning to destroy everything Clara built, and you let it happen." The room seemed to close in around them, the silence more deafening than any words could ever be. Taylor's heart pounded in her chest as she stood before him, waiting for the response she knew was coming. Waiting for him to say the one thing that could bring them both some semblance of peace. "I'm sorry," Ethan said finally, his voice raw, broken. "I should have told you. I should have faced it. But I didn't. I didn't know how. I thought if I kept it hidden, it would all go away. That I could protect you, protect Emma. But I was wrong. I've been so wrong." The apology was soft, gentle, and yet it felt like a hollow gesture, a pale shadow of the man he had once been. The man who had promised to protect them both. The man who had failed them. "I don't know how to fix it," he whispered, looking at her with tear-filled eyes. "I don't know if we can fix it, but I'll try, Taylor. I'll do whatever it takes. I can't lose you. I can't lose her." The finality of his words, the admission of his fear, shattered something deep inside of Taylor. She had known for so long that there was a truth waiting to come out, a truth they had both been avoiding. But hearing it, hearing him admit it, hearing him finally own up to his failures, their failures, was more than she could bear. Her anger, her hurt, her grief seemed to catch in her throat, and for a moment she stood there staring at him, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to tell him that his apology wasn't enough, that nothing would ever be enough. But another part of her, the part that still loved him, the part that still wanted to believe in the man he could be, wanted to hold him, to comfort him, to tell him that it would be okay. "I don't know either," Taylor whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if we can fix it either, Ethan. But I'm not sure I can keep pretending that we're okay when we're not." She took a step back, her heart aching as she looked at him, seeing the man he could have been, the man he still might be, if only they could both find their way out of the wreckage they had created together. And for the first time in weeks, Ethan reached for her, slowly, tentatively, as if afraid she would pull away, but Taylor didn't move. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know how they would fix this, if they ever could. But in that moment, she realized that they could at least start by facing the truth. The ugly, painful, heart-shattering truth. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to begin the long road of healing. The silence that had enveloped them in the wake of the truth was suffocating, yet strangely liberating. Taylor had always believed that facing the truth would be a cathartic experience. But in the moments following Ethan's confession, she realized that truth, while necessary, was far more painful than she had anticipated. It had shattered the delicate facade they had both constructed, exposing the raw underbelly of their grief, their failures, and their unmet expectations. But even as the truth hung between them, there was an undeniable shift, a change in the way they looked at each other, in the way their hearts, though bruised and broken, began to beat a little faster. In the wake of the storm, something had begun to change. The emotional walls between them, once towering and impassable, were beginning to crumble piece by piece. And beneath it all, there was a flicker of hope, fragile but real. As the days passed, the space between them grew less suffocating. They still hadn't found all the answers, still hadn't figured out how to rebuild what had been broken, but there was something different in the way they moved around each other. It wasn't about pretending that everything was fixed. It was about acknowledging the truth, accepting it, and allowing themselves to be vulnerable enough to take the first steps toward healing. It was early one evening when Taylor found herself sitting at the kitchen counter, sorting through more papers, business documents, financial statements, and the remnants of Clara's work that still needed to be addressed. The soft hum of the apartment was a strange comfort as she sifted through the stacks of papers, her mind wandering between the future she had promised to create for Emma and the life she had almost given up on. The weight of the past was still with her, but there was a lightness in her chest now, a quiet certainty that no matter what, she would not lose herself again. Ethan had been quiet most of the day, his presence steady but distant. He had left early for a meeting, but when he returned, there was something in his eyes, something that felt different. There was a subtle urgency in the way he moved, the way he stepped into the room and stopped when he saw her sitting there. The familiar warmth of his gaze met hers, but this time, it wasn't just sadness or guilt. It was something more, a sense of resolve. He cleared his throat as he stepped toward her, his movements deliberate but careful. "Taylor," he began, his voice low but sure. "I've been thinking about everything, about us." Taylor looked up, meeting his eyes, her heart skipping a beat. There was a strange calm in the way he spoke, as though he had come to a conclusion, as though the uncertainty that had clouded their relationship for so long was finally starting to lift. "I know we've been through so much," he continued, his voice softer now, his hand reaching out toward her. "And I know that things between us have been broken. But I also know that I can't let go of what we have. I can't let go of you." The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended in the quiet space between them, and Taylor felt her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't just an apology. This wasn't just a conversation about healing. This was something more. "I don't know how we're going to get through all of this," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I do know that I want to try. I want to try with you. I want to build something together. I want to rebuild us. I can't promise that it will be easy, that it won't take time or patience. But I want it, Taylor. I want you." Taylor's heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing with everything that had led them here. She had been so caught up in the weight of responsibility, in the fear of losing herself again, that she had forgotten the one thing that had always remained: constant love. Not the kind of love built on obligation, but the kind that was rooted in the deepest parts of her soul, the kind that she had once felt for Ethan, the kind that was still there, flickering beneath the surface, waiting for them both to acknowledge it. Ethan's eyes softened as he stepped closer, kneeling down in front of her, his hand reaching for hers. For a moment, Taylor was paralyzed with the sheer tenderness of the gesture. It wasn't just a man asking for forgiveness. It wasn't just a plea for her to accept him again. It was a question that had always been there, buried beneath everything else they had been through. "I've never wanted anything more than to be with you." "Taylor," Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "And I'm asking you now, not as a man who's lost everything, but as a man who's found something worth fighting for." Taylor's chest tightened, the emotion swirling within her, and for the first time she felt like the fog was lifting. The pain, the confusion, the uncertainty, they were still there. Yes, but there was something else now. There was a sense of possibility, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could build something beautiful, something new from the rubble of what had come before. She couldn't speak at first, the lump in her throat too thick to allow the words to come. But when she finally did, her voice was shaky but resolute. "What are you asking, Ethan?" she whispered, her gaze locked on his. Ethan took a deep breath, his hand trembling slightly as he pulled something small from his pocket, a velvet box, simple and elegant, but holding within it a symbol of everything he had just said. He opened it slowly, the soft click of the box, a small sound that seemed to fill the room, and inside was a ring, silver and simple, yet beautiful in its simplicity. "I'm asking you to marry me, Taylor," he said, his voice thick with hope and vulnerability. "I'm asking you to give us a chance to rebuild. I'm asking you to choose me, to choose us, and to let me spend the rest of my life making it right." For a moment, Taylor could only stare at the ring, her heart hammering in her chest, the world around her slowing down. She had never imagined this moment would come. Not like this. Not after everything they had been through. And yet there it was, the question she had both feared and longed for. Tears welled in her eyes, her chest tightening as the realization washed over her. She had been so lost in the pain, in the fear and the chaos, that she had forgotten the one thing that had always remained: love. The kind that was messy, that was imperfect, but that was still worth fighting for. She reached for the ring, her fingers trembling as she took it from the box and slipped it onto her finger. The cool metal, a symbol of everything they had been through, everything they had yet to face. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking, but filled with something more. Yes, I will marry you, Ethan. I'll try. I'll fight for us. Ethan's eyes lit up, his face breaking into a smile that was both relieved and joyful, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. He stood up slowly, his hands gently cupping her face as he kissed her forehead, the tenderness of the moment sealing the promise between them. And in that moment, as the ring sparkled on her finger, Taylor realized that while the road ahead would still be difficult, while there were still things they needed to face, they had taken the first step together. They had chosen each other, and that was enough to rebuild what had been broken, together. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a soft golden light across the city, as if the world itself were holding its breath in anticipation. The once silent penthouse, now filled with the hum of life and love, stood as a quiet witness to everything that had come before and everything that was yet to come. Taylor stood by the window, watching the sky transform from hues of pink and orange to the deeper blues of nightfall. For the first time in what felt like forever, the city did not seem foreign or daunting. It was home, and for the first time in months it felt like her home too. Behind her, the soft sounds of movement filled the space. Ethan was in the kitchen humming a song under his breath as he prepared dinner, while Emma played in the living room, her laughter ringing out in the way it always had before. The house was alive with warmth again, not just because the lights had been turned back on, but because there was a new energy here, one that had been missing for far too long. Taylor let out a quiet breath, her hand resting lightly on the cool glass of the window. She had come a long way since the night she had found the truth about Clara's business, about Celeste's betrayal, about the painful revelations that had upended everything she had known. The weight of those moments had nearly broken her, but now as she stood here, she realized that she had emerged stronger, more certain of herself than she had ever been. She wasn't just a caretaker anymore, a protector. She was Taylor, the woman who had rebuilt her own life piece by piece, and the woman who had learned to forgive not just others but herself. The road to this place had been long filled with grief, with doubt, with moments where it seemed like they would never find their way out of the darkness. But they had, together. They had faced the wreckage of their past, and with every piece had begun to create something new. They were no longer living in the shadow of Clara's legacy or the betrayal that had come to light. They were living in the truth of their own hearts. "Dinner's almost ready," Ethan called from the kitchen. His voice light, his tone filled with the kind of warmth that had once felt so out of reach. Taylor smiled to herself, turning away from the window. "I can't wait," she replied, her voice soft, her heart swelling with affection as she crossed the room toward the kitchen. As she walked into the warm, bustling space, Ethan turned to face her, a playful grin on his face. He was no longer the man lost in his grief, the man broken by his past. He was the man she had always known he could be: strong, compassionate, and above all, willing to fight for what mattered most. "I think we finally earned this," he said, holding out a glass of wine, his eyes twinkling with something new, a joy, a peace that had taken root in his heart and was now blooming in theirs. Taylor took the glass, their fingers brushing as she accepted it. For a moment they simply stood there, taking in the quiet beauty of the moment. It was an ordinary evening, yes, but in its simplicity there was magic. The kind of magic that only comes after the storm has passed, after the weight of the world has been lifted, and you realize that what's left is more than enough. "I think we have," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder as she met his gaze. "And we've earned so much more than just this." Ethan smiled, the warmth in his eyes deepening. "What's that?" "Us," she whispered, her heart full. "We've earned a future together." He reached for her, then pulling her close, his arms wrapping around her, in the comfort of a home they had built together, one moment, one decision at a time. "I'm not going anywhere, Taylor. Not now, not ever." And in that moment, everything that had once felt uncertain, everything that had once felt broken, felt whole. The past was still there, a part of them, a part of their journey, but it no longer defined them. It was simply the road that had led them here, to this place, to this moment. As they stood there holding each other in the soft light of their new beginning, Emma's laughter echoed in the background, her joy a reminder of the healing that had taken place. She had lost so much just as they had, but now she was beginning to find her way back. And in time, she would understand that the true strength of a family didn't come from perfection. It came from the willingness to fight for one another, to love one another, and to rebuild together no matter how hard the journey. Dinner was ready before long, and the three of them sat down at the table together, Ethan, Taylor, and Emma. The meal was simple, but it was perfect in its simplicity. They talked and laughed the evening, stretching out in the kind of quiet contentment that had once seemed impossible. For the first time in a long time, they weren't just surviving. They were living together. As the night went on, Taylor allowed herself to savor this new reality. This was not the life she had planned. This was not the life she had imagined for herself all those years ago when she first came to New York with hopes and dreams. But as she sat there with the people she loved most in the world, she realized that sometimes life doesn't go according to plan. Sometimes the path you end up on is the one you needed all along. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Taylor woke up with a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The future was still uncertain, still full of questions and challenges, but it was also full of possibility. The kind of possibility that comes with second chances, with forgiveness, with the willingness to love again. She stood by the window once more, the city stretching out before her, and for the first time it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like a place where she could breathe, a place where she could build the life she had always dreamed of. Not alone, but with the people she loved, with the people who had helped her find her way back to herself. And as she stood there, her fingers resting gently on the window frame, she knew that this was only the beginning. Call to action. If you found yourself on a journey of healing and hope, if you face the challenges of love and loss, take a moment to reflect on how far you've come. Remember, no matter how difficult the road may seem, the future is full of new beginnings, and it's never too late to start over. If you've been inspired by Taylor's story, share your own journey with us. How have you rebuilt your life after loss? Leave a comment below and let us know how you found strength in the face of adversity.